sense. But before we get there this morning, we're going to continue looking at the Sermon on the Mount. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 33, Matthew 5:33. And we're going to actually be taking this in sections this morning. So starting in verse 33, you have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not break your vows. You must carry out the vows you make to the Lord, but I say, do not make any vows. Do not say by heaven, because God is in his throne, and do not say by the earth, because the earth is his footstool, and do not say by Jerusalem, for Jerusalem is the city of the great king. Do not even say by my head, for you can't turn one hair black or white. Just a simple yes, I will, or no, I won't. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. So let's put this into modern day language. How many of us, when we were kids, ever said, well, I'm going to make a pinky promise with someone? Or cross my heart and hope to die? Or swear on your mother's life? Swear on your child's life? Brother, sister, some people would happily throw some people under the bus like that and not care about it. But what is Jesus actually getting here? Essentially, that we should not swear or promise anything outside of something that is outside of our control. Why? My grandpa said it best many years ago, let your yes be yes and let your no be no. I mean, that's very simple, common, I hate to say older generation mentality, but that's almost something that's been lost in today's society. My uncle that comes to visit a lot with my parents, his favorite thing in all of this town is there's a picture in the cattle exchange of two cowboys. I think they're shaking hands, or it looks like they're about to shake hands. It's up on the wall above the kitchen. And he loves that for some reason, and every time he tells me the exact same thing. He said, well, that's when a man's word meant a man's word. Because it used to be back in the day when two men shook hands and they agreed on something, that's all you needed. Before the days of lawyers and contracts and everything. Why? Because Jesus is saying here the same thing. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Because anything outside of that, you're putting other people in harm many times. But why is he saying this? Christians should be people that always keep their word. Or, as the slide this morning, a Christian should always keep his word. This whole time that we've been looking from the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus is addressing these issues and these topics, he's trying to show us how to live, especially these Jewish people, a good life, a better life, even better than the law that they had been given by Moses. Why? So that when people saw them, so that what? People could see that they are different. Even if you take this in today's society, how many people have ever been told by someone, I promise you I'm going to get this done? And then they didn't do it. Okay? How many of us as kids, when our parents asked us to do something, Mom, I promise you I'm going to get this done before the day's over? Anybody else? And then how many times do we get distracted and forget to do it? Yeah. How many of us have told our gentlemen, our wives, that we're going to get something done that's on our honey-do list, and it has been sitting there for 3 to 6 months? Yeah. I still have something on there. I have happily used the whole hospital thing as an excuse a little bit. She's homesick this morning, and y'all can totally rat me out that I said that. Why? Why would Jesus say this? Because many times when we make promises, many times we should not have made those promises. Even if there is an inkling that we say, I promise you I'm going to get this done. If you can't fulfill that promise and you don't fulfill it, how does that reflect on you if you don't get it done? Well or poorly? many times poorly. So Jesus is saying what? Just a simple yes, I will, no, or I won't. Because the way that we carry ourselves reflects on us. Now, that's the simple one for this morning. These next two are going to be the fun ones. Revenge and dealing with those who don't like us. And I love how Jesus opens this in verse 38. You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it for 2 miles. Give to those who ask and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. Now, let's just take the simple human natural reaction this morning. If somebody walks up to you and smacks you in the face, what is the first thing that you're going to want to do back? Smack them right back. And I just want to say, I am glad that it is our older people who led the response on that. Because I heard y'all the loudest. And why do I say that? Because at our base instinct, if somebody smacks us or punches us, we want to smack them right back. 2 years ago, we had what became known as Slapgate, or the slap heard around the world, with Chris Rock and Will Smith at the Oscars. And what happened as soon as that issue happened? The entire room went silent. Because what did everybody think that Chris Rock was about to do to Will Smith? Smack him back, go to town on him. But instead, him being a comedian, he did what? He made a joke, and then he kept on going. But when it comes to actually dealing with people that hurt us, do we like it when people hurt us? No. Because if we were honest, and if we would say, quote unquote, take Jesus out of the conversation, if somebody hurt us, what would be the first thing that we would do to them? Go at it and solve it. Somebody told me years ago that the difference between boys and girls when they're younger, we'll just say high school age. Boys fight it out and get it over with, and high school girls can cause a lot of drama and get back even that way. If you've ever been around high schoolers, you know that's true. If you've ever been a high schooler, you know that's true. Some things have not changed through the ages. But there's something about when someone wrongs us that internally, what do we want to do to them? We want to put them down, because sadly, and I'll admit that the same is true for me, sometimes when we put people down, it makes us feel better, if we're honest. But if this is the Old Testament, that this is actually part of the Jewish law, as Jesus is expounding here, verse 39, but I say, do not resist an evil person, one. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. It's not that you're not fulfilling what you are supposed to do under the law. Rather, it is what the law permisses or what the law allows. So just because you are able to do something, does that mean you should do something? That's the question that's at stake here. So just because Jesus is saying, just because the law says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, if somebody does you wrong, that you can do it, doesn't necessarily mean that it is good for you to do it. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. I mean, how many of us, if somebody rightly takes something of ours, we want to give them something else? So what is starting to enter this conversation? We're starting to move from selfishness to selflessness. And is that something that is natural to us? No. Because if we were to take the base instinct of humankind, most people are naturally selfish. There are very few who I would call the blessed few who have no selfish bone in their body. and they are saints like no one else. But it takes something or someone to change us, to move us from selfish to selfless. I like to think about it this way. When you are little, or if you are raising a little one, aka toddlers, and they're playing with toys, what is the number one thing we have to teach them how to do? Share. Because if they have their favorite toy and another kid wants to play with it, everything can go wrong in an instant. Clara was involved in an incident a little over 2 years ago when she was in the 1-year-old room at daycare. And 2 little 1-year-olds got in it over a little toy. I'm like, why would that matter? And I started thinking, well, if that's both of their favorite toys at daycare and they both want it, what's going to happen? And as I've learned, my child has no give in her, and if she wants something, she's very well going to try to get what she wants. And so if you've ever had a child at the little house and something happens, you get to sign a good old incident report. And so that day, wasn't me who had to pick her up, so Mama had to sign an incident report. And we're like, Clara, you have to share. I want it. But how much do we as humans and adults really change from when we're little? I've said for many years, most guys don't grow up. Their toys just get bigger and more expensive. Because really, we like what we like and we want to do what we want to do, and we try to make everything work around it. But Jesus is trying to teach people from being people that just because you can do that doesn't mean that you should, to just because you are here and you don't have to be selfish and you can be selfless, you can do it. In verse 41, he moves to a different kind of thing. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it for 2. At this time, for Jewish people, because they were under the Roman control, any person in the Roman legions that had a bunch of heavy gear could literally come up to a Jewish citizen and say, carry my gear for a mile, and you were obligated to do it. And if you didn't do it, guess where you ended up? Jail. And so Jesus is saying, you know what? Even with those people whom you really don't like, the people who are occupying your land, who have complete control over your lives, if they ask you to do it for a mile, carry it for 2 and be the nicest people to them. And so not only in the way that people treat us, but in the way, even when we're mistreated or if something bad happens, be the selfish people that he has called us to be. Verse 42, give to those who ask and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. Some translations say give to all who ask. Could you imagine if we lived our lives in such a way to where when someone asked us for something that we always said yes? Imagine if someone every minute of every day asked you for $1 and you had to say yes. How much money would you have left? Not a lot. And if they asked me for $1, my general philosophy is I literally never have cash on me. So I'm like, I literally have no cash to give you. I've literally taken my wallet out to a homeless person and said, see, I have nothing. Because they were like, you have something. And I was like, no, I really don't. But if we were to summarize this section, there's 2 things here. The first thing is the Christian should always be ready to forgive, especially about the whole eye for an eye thing. But the other thing here is, and this isn't on a slide, is that God has called us to be selfless people. Imagine how much different our world would be if we truly cared as much about other people as we did about ourselves. The golden rule, we'll get to that here in a couple weeks. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, whether you teach the Bible in school anymore or you don't, in most elementary classrooms, they still make that good old poster that says the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But how much even better would it be if we as Christians showed the love of Christ in ways such as this, that we loved people more than we loved ourselves, and that we tried to help people more than we tried to help ourselves? Would people think that we are weird people? Yes. Would we start to think ourselves would be weird? Yes. But God has called us to live in such a way to where we stand out to the world as people that are different than everyone else. Why? So that through that we can share Jesus with people. When people ask us, why are you different? Because Jesus has called me to be. And I want to do what he has called me to do. Verse 43, you have heard that the law says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Once again, just because the law allows it doesn't mean that it is what we should do. It doesn't mean that we have to do it. So when we talk about that the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus comes to discuss the law and to add more to the law or to explain the law better, here's the way that I've started to think about it. Just because something is permissible does not mean that it is right. I will say that again and again as we keep going through this next month. We talked last week about divorce, and we said, God does not want divorce if it is at all avoidable. His plan for man and woman was not that divorce should happen, but he makes allowances for it because he knew that at some point people would split. And so he gives grounds for that. We talked about that last week. But this week, just because that the law says it doesn't mean that we have to do it. Next week, we're going to continue that line. But I say, love your enemies. If we were to truly take a couple of moments today, I don't think most people in here would have actually people, if they were to write on a list, their enemies list. For our younger people, my age, a little bit younger, who have seen the movie Mean Girls, when you have burn books, and you write all your enemies in there, and you write the worst things and the meanest things about them, then you literally have an enemies list. But as we have grown up, as we've gotten older, to when we actually think about people outside of our general lives, outside of our circles, we wouldn't necessarily say that we have enemies, but how many of us would say, if we're honest, that we have people who we don't necessarily like? I'll admit it. I have no problem admitting my sins in front of the church. But it's not that they're my enemy, but if I don't like them, and here's what I've come to learn the older that I've gotten, many times it's not that I don't like them, there's something about them that either they might have or that I might want, or they don't act a certain way that I think they should act. But I can't control someone else. I can only control myself. And so when we're talking about even people who we don't like, even if there's not an actual enemies list of people that we would print their picture out, stick it on a dartboard, and throw darts at their face. But Jesus is calling us to pray for those people. He's calling us to love those people. A Christian should always pray for their enemies, and a Christian should always love their enemies. A Christian should always be the person that goes above and beyond, even with people who they don't like or can't stand, to be the nicest people to them. And we're not even talking about that nice little face that most of us can put on that says, oh, how are you today? Wonderful. Oh, you look great today. Oh, have you lost weight? And try to make them feel better. Not that false kind of building and puffing them up. who are outside our immediate circles. Verse 45, in the same way you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven, for he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you only love those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even the corrupt tax collectors do that. If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even the pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. I talked last week about how last Saturday we had a wedding in here, and talking about love and marriage, and one of the scriptures that was used at the wedding was, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. That he would love so much that he would be willing to give his life up for her. When we think about Jesus, when we think about his love and his mercy and his grace, we often like to think of it as how it applies immediately to us. When we sing old gospel songs about the faith, many times it's how the blood has covered us, how Jesus' sacrifice changes us. And we talk about that immediate change for the purpose of salvation. But in the process of discipleship after that, many times we're okay with that change to where God calls us to come to him to ask for forgiveness of sins. But if we just stop there, we're not going to continue to change to be made more like Jesus. We're not going to be people that love people. It's like that good old-fashioned saying, well, I got my fire insurance, now what else do I need? But many years ago, I was told this, and since then, I've used it many times. And you've heard me say this many times. How much different would our world be if Christians actually loved like Jesus? How much different would our church be if we all loved each other like Jesus? How much different would our town be if we all loved each other like Jesus? That when somebody had a wrong thing against us, instead of going off on them like we could, just because we can doesn't mean that we should, that we say, okay, let's just settle this and let's move on. Or when someone has someone against you and you would actually consider them an enemy, and instead of you having an issue back at them, you go to them and be not just the big person, but say, hey, my Savior says that I need to love you and I want to bury this and move on, and let's try to actually be friends. Or even not friends, let's just be to where we're okay with each other. Somebody told me years ago, you don't have to be friends with everybody, and you can't be. But you can be acquaintances with people. You can be on good terms with everyone. Christ has called all Christians to be peaceable with everyone. And if we're called to love everyone, then that means that we need to be able to actually get along with everyone. Now, does that mean that that's going to be easy? By no means. No. But how much different would it be if the way that we treated people and the way that we act toward people was different than everyone around us? What would that show people? If people truly were able to see Jesus in us, would that change our relationships with other people? But that has to begin with this question. Do people see Jesus in you on a daily basis? Yes or no? And if you say no, why not? If you say yes, okay, let's keep going. Why do they see Jesus? What makes that difference? It's almost like one of those charts, if you're a social media person, Facebook has them all the time. Here's the first question. If you answer yes, you go this way. If you go no, you go this way. Anybody seen those? But if you started and you went to know, do people see Jesus in me? Then you have to ask this question: what in my life is keeping people from seeing Jesus in me? Or what are my actions that are keeping people from seeing Jesus in me? Verse 45 states it, in the same way you will be acting as true children if you do it. Because God's grace and mercy applies to everyone evenly. His common grace and his common mercy. Now let me explain that. Theologically speaking, common grace and his common mercy are that he allows the world to keep going and keep existing. How he keeps providing for each and every single person on the earth by providing the seasons, by providing the rain. Because when we think back to when God essentially wiped the earth out with the flood, besides Noah and his family, what was the judgment that God made on the earth? That these people are full of sin. Same thing was said of Sodom and Gomorrah. These people are full of sin. Lot even tried, well, what about if there's this many people? What about if this many people? But God's common grace and his common mercy keeps us here. But in that common grace and common mercy, it is up to us to share about the ultimate grace and the ultimate mercy to people that can only come through Jesus Christ, his Son. You see, God has just allowed this moment in time, for however long it might last here on earth, for the gospel to go out to the nations until one day he finally comes back. I was listening to Max Lucado give an interview. If you've ever read enough Christian literature throughout the years, that name should sound familiar. And he was talking, and he said, we are closer now to the end times than we have ever been. If you start looking at the conditions for what it takes for Armageddon or the end times to come, that all the nations that can rise up against Israel are predicted in the book of Revelation are there, and they are almost at war with Israel. And one of the things that must stand out to us as Christians is that there is coming a time to where there won't be time one day for people to make a choice whether to choose Jesus or not. On Wednesday nights, we've been walking through Revelation. Right now, we're in the happy part. We're just like, and John saw Jesus in all his glory, and it's like happy. But if you know enough about the book of Revelation, when you start getting to the middle of it, do things get better or do things get worse? They get way worse really quick. It is more important now than ever for us in the Christian church. I'm not even saying for us as Baptists, but for us as Christian people to share Jesus as much as we can, as often as we can. And the easiest way that we can show people is through our actions. Because it is true, one day Jesus is coming back, and at that point there will be no second chances for people. Because trusting Jesus is a yes or a no decision. It's like Jesus said in making promises or making vows, however you want to say it. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. That decision stands for each and every single one of us here. For most people in here, as far as I know, if you've made that yes to follow Jesus. But at some point, there's sadly not going to be a point for people to make that. Because if you've been around long enough on this earth to have heard the gospel at one point, then if you did not accept it, then you chose no. Because sadly, when we hear the gospel, we either accept it or we deny it. There's no middle ground. I've talked to kids and I've talked to teenagers and I've talked to adults throughout the years, and they say, well, I'm not ready yet. And I'm like, well, then what are you waiting for? I've still never gotten a good answer on that one. But ladies and gentlemen and teenagers and kids, it is more important now for us to reflect Jesus in our lives than ever before. You know, people all over the world are starting to panic that we're going into World War III. And we very well could end up that way. You know, somebody said, well, so many people came to Christ during World War II. And I said, I bet so. When you have bullets flying at you and you're in the trenches, and you better want to make sure that you know who Jesus is. A lot of people were saved that way. But I can't ever say this enough, is that you have people who you know that don't know Jesus, that you might be the only Jesus that they see. In the way that you act, in the way that they see you, my prayer is that they do see Jesus through you. My hope is that they see Jesus through you. But sometimes that we actually have to have those conversations with people and just say, you know, am I willing to risk this relationship so that they might know Jesus Christ? Because the best testimony about who Christians are Christians. And the worst testimony about who Christians are Christians. It goes that one way or the other. There's no middle ground. But the same thing is true about salvation in Christ. There's no middle ground. You either know him or you don't. You either chose him or you denied him. The world will always be ready to judge the church. The world will always be ready to judge Christians. And sadly, many times we give them a lot of ammo to do so. How much better would it be for us and for the world if we actually acted like Christ has called us to?